Are you going through a season that's challenging your faith? Do you feel like your joy is not what it used to be? Did you return to your faith after wandering away and feel like the enemy's attacks are stronger than ever? Do you want to hear from God and discern the lies from the truth? And more importantly, do you want to strengthen your relationship with God? Sister, I'm here to encourage you and help you in your journey back to Jesus, back to your first love. I want to help you reignite your faith again so that you can have renewed joy. Let's do this together, sister. Welcome back to part 2. If you weren't with us last week, my sister, you got to tune in. You got to go back to that episode. And we started Job chapter 1. There's things we talked about with my amazing husband and my special guest for this month of July. We're studying the book of Job and really the underlying theme of suffering and God's ultimate purposes, right? And God's sovereignty. So I'm excited to bring back Fernando for part 2 as we continue Job chapter 1, since it is so much, there's so much goodness in here, so much to unwrap. We did have to break this into 2 different episodes. So we're going to continue today. All right, Fernando, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right, so let's do it. So last time we ended up, well, just kind of give a little wrap up of what we, just quick, super 1 minute wrap up of what we talk about for those that missed the first episode. And then let's go ahead and continue into the last part.
Yeah, so we talked about how Job is this messianic prefigure, a prefiguration of Christ, and that already within the book of Job, God is demonstrating to his people and to us the manner in which Satan will be overcome. And so Job represents not just the innocent sufferer, but he's pointing us towards the innocent sufferer who ultimately removed our sins and once and for all overcame and toppled death itself. And that's an important aspect of reading this story. So we talked about how Job is presented within the story as this prophetic, kingly, priestly figure, which is incredibly important because the Messiah is prophet, priest, king. And we also talked about how Satan presenting himself in the heavenly courts, connecting that with where we see this idea of Satan being cast out of heaven in the New Testament. These ideas sort of intersect here, and that ultimately it is the witness of the early Christians. They're being told in Revelations 12 that their witness and their being willing to be killed for the sake of the gospel is the manner, along with and especially because of the blood of Christ. Those things combined is what is tearing Satan out of. They are overcoming Satan. He's being torn out of heaven because of these actions. And so that's all incredibly relevant, because what we do see within the early Christian story is that the innocent righteous ones are suffering in order for Satan to be overcome, and that their suffering and their death is ultimately their triumph, and they're ultimately also imitating Christ in this. And Job is this early representation of this very pattern. And so what I wanted to do today is continue along in Job chapter 1 to capture a little bit more of what we're talking about here. So we'll pick up in verse 13, and it says, "One day, when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The fire of God fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, 'The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. At this Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So, this is obviously an incredibly heavy moment in the story. He's been handed over to Satan, to allow Satan to do whatever he's going to do, with this idea that there's a testing going on. This idea that Satan has said that he is going to basically turn his back on God as a result. And the chapter closes with the narrative informing us that in nothing that Job did he sin against God. In fact, his reaction is very different from how I feel I would deal with this sort of tragedy. I think it is very human to turn and kind of point fingers at God when we face calamities. And Job is exceptional in this, in that he doesn't turn against God. He very much is able to accept both the good and the bad from God. Now, there's a few things that are worth highlighting here. So we see that certainly Job was a wealthy person, so he's having his wealth taken away from him. And it's one thing to see that these various groups, the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans, are organizing against you. You can kind of look at that and be like, okay, Satan must be against me, right? Satan is orchestrating wicked men to create this loss for me. But the narrative takes a turn when in verse 16 the servant shows up and tells Job the fire of God fell from heaven. Right now, we're being told that this is all being done at Satan's hand, and this means he's presenting these calamities as if it's coming from God. He wants Job to believe that this is specifically from God. Now, indirectly, we can say, yes, God could have prevented it. God, it tells us that God allows this to happen. So it's not to say that Satan's operating in his own right, but it is Satan who's striking him. And he's doing it in such a way not to reveal himself, but to point the finger at God. And we see this also with the wind that comes out of the desert that strikes the corners of the house of his children and collapses the house on them. That it's these natural disasters of God's domain that is being used against him. What Satan is doing here is he's making the signs appear like it is God who has set himself against him. And that's why Job himself in the chapters to come is very much believing that God has set himself against him. Now, when we think about that idea of God being set against the individual, this actually points us to something. And what it points us to is some of the language that we see repeated throughout the prophecy of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Right? We see this spoken of in verses 3 and 4, where it says that the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Now that specifically, that line there relates to Jesus, but it goes on, it says, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. Like pretty much all the other verses, if we remove that part about him taking on our our suffering, him taking on our sin, everything else kind of parallels to Job. Like he's this person, and we'll see this later on in the narrative, how he's covered in boils, that he's the kind of person that people hide their face from, that he's this person who's rejected. He's sitting on an ash heap, scraping himself with pottery shards. Like, you know, um, he's this person who's stricken, he's afflicted, he's punished by God, right? We see it go on where it says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. So again, this is all in prophecy of Jesus, but we can see these parallels, that he's unjustly being oppressed and afflicted, that he's this individual who undergoes, like when his friends first show up, they just sit in silence, like he's enduring his suffering in silence. It goes on to say, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. Like all of this, again, it's pointing to Jesus. It's prophesying about Jesus. And the most complete presentation of these passages is in Jesus. And yet we can look at that and be like, hey, there's glimpses of this in the person of Job. We see this idea of him being crushed and him suffering, that it's the Lord's will that this should happen. And yet, nevertheless, that he's going to see his offspring, that he's going to prolong his days, and that the will of the Lord is going to prosper in his hands, and that he's still going to see the light of life and be satisfied. As we go through this story, that's ultimately what we're going to see. We're going to see that despite him sitting in the depths of despair, and a lot of the language is him just talking about, like, I'm in the grave. Like I'm dead. Like, I'm just waiting for God to do the coup de grace. That's basically where Job is at, and yet it tells us in the end that he's blessed immensely, and those blessings are important to understand within their context, and we'll get to that in a later recording. But to understand that Job presents here as in almost like limited suffering servant, right?
So, yeah, oh my gosh, so much good stuff. Now, we know that so far from what we'd read in Job 1, we saw that God did tell Satan not to touch Job. So he said, just don't touch him. So he takes all these things away, including his children, which as a parent, you and I are parents, I can imagine the pain. Just can't even fathom the pain that was. But at the same time, at this point, he was not touched physically yet. Tell us about that a little bit. Like, we see Job's reaction, and he did not curse God. So we're going to be looking at, coming up soon, this other part where, Satan's going to actually physically have Job suffer. But how are these two, how can we relate one type of the way, just kind of like, this is how I see maybe an example. Maybe you can tell us more. But sometimes we are taking away things like material things. We might lose our jobs. We might be having a hard time finding a job. We may be suffering financially for no reason, maybe of our own fault. Perhaps a medical thing that a medical expense from a family member, something happened, right? So we'll lose things. Not every one of us will go through that, but a lot of people on this world, and we're living in a great country here if you're listening in the United States, but many people in the world right now suffer through that, just poverty. So these are things that already cause us suffering. And also, we lose family members, for various reasons. And so that's a kind of suffering. So tell us about the differences. Maybe give us a little foreshadowing, perhaps, of what we'll see coming up next, and how that can compare to now. And maybe give us a little teaser of Joe's reaction to that before we get into the next episode next week.
Yeah, so a couple things immediately come to mind. First off, when we think of Jesus leaving the heavenly courts to come down in the flesh, he himself is coming down to live kind of like a servant, right? He comes down, he's not born in a palace, he's not born as a king in wealth. He's coming down poverty stricken, right? As a refugee, as someone fleeing from imminent death. His parents have to take him into Egypt because King Herod wants him dead. Here's someone who's born into a set of circumstances which are not enviable. And I think in a lot of ways, what we see in Job through the first chapter is this parallel of him being stripped away of his kingly status. He's being stripped away of the material outward sort of blessings, and he's cast into this situation of poverty. Now, what we do see within this is that in Jesus's ministry, we see that these are the very people that Jesus associates with. Like we see in Matthew 25 that it is the poor, the destitute, the broken, that he says, when you serve people like this, you're serving me. He's not just saying these are good people to take care of because that's like the right thing to do. He's literally saying that that's me. And what you do for the least of these, you've done for me, which means that Jesus, God, associates with the lowly, associates with the poverty stricken, associates with the afflicted, the diseased. And what is his answer to that? Well, his answer to that is the church. The church is meant to be the relief. It's meant to be the one that takes care of the poor, the suffering, and those who suffer injustice. And and that is also a part of what, and we talked about it in the previous episode, it's a part of what we see Job doing in his life. Like when he talks about what he was doing prior, he talks about taking care of the poor, taking care of the widow, taking care of the fatherless, like clothing those who needed the clothing, feeding those who needed the food. Like he very much represents within himself that ministry towards those who suffer. And I think this is a call for us, especially in the West, where we're surrounded by so much abundance. It can be easy for us to look at those who don't have as much and kind of write it off. And we write it off in various ways, but oftentimes the way we do so is to, in our own way, assume that it's because of their own poor choices, or it's because you're not working hard, and certainly it is the case that we don't want to enable bad behaviors, right? Like if someone's just always looking for handouts within the community of believers, it's like no, your role is to become the giver.
Yeah.
And we see this represented in the New Testament where Paul, and I'll have to get the reference, but he talks about those who are stealing, stop stealing and get a job. And why should you get a job? So that you can have something to give those in need.
Wow.
Right. And so the orientation of the church needs to be towards being the solution for the pain and the suffering. That's what Jesus did. And so I think that's ultimately what this is foreshadowing is that Job himself, he loses everything, and we kind of see the response that, his friends, God bless them, they maybe weren't the most encouraging, but at least they did one thing right in that they showed up. And his family later shows up, and we see other friends and family who go to support him. And I think that's all part of this story here.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so we are wrapping up this episode with that thought. Thank you so much, my amazing husband, Fernando. He has just been such a blessing to me. I love him so much. I love you, baby. So, I hope that you were encouraged so far. I know that we have so much more to study in the book of Job, and don't worry, sister, it is coming. So we'll be looking at more next week and actually in the next couple of weeks for the rest of this month. So I pray that you were encouraged. Please visit theintentionalchristianwoman.com for all the things. You want to sign up for my monthly love letter. You want to join our community. We're having a conversation in there about this. Go to theintentionalchristianwoman.com. Let's have a conversation. Let's see what you got out of it. And I would love your insight as well. So I love you, my sister, and I will see you in the next episode. Sister, I truly pray that this episode has blessed you and has encouraged your heart today. If it did, would you share it with a friend? Also, would you leave me a review? Not only do I love reading my reviews, the reviews actually help the show be found by others who could use the encouragement. And if you want more resources that could help your walk with God, simply visit theintentionalchristianwoman.com. You'll find all kinds of goodness in there. Sister, know that I love you and I am praying for you, and I will see you in the next episode.